Good evening. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Before I get started, I just want to say one little thing. The Bob Moses Legacy Conference series, the idea for that was when my husband's memorial service in 2021, and Paul Paravano and I said, well, why don't we do this? So I just had to mention that Paul was part of that decision, and we're going to have our third conference in April. From my bedroom window, I looked out at passengers lining the platform of the 3rd Avenue elevated train, which snaked its way through the South Bronx. The weatherman on the radio predicted weather, cloudy, but cloudy could mean, when I looked out on the platform, pouring rain. I found that the weatherman's predictions were frequently incorrect, but I could always count on the folks who were out in the elements to reveal the true weather. I thought that in this 250th year since the founding of the nation, 60 years since the 20th century tumultuous dust-up of the Civil Rights Movement, and the 50th anniversary of MIT's Martin Luther King Jr. gathering, I would try to make sense of how this nation got to where it is today, from my point of view, the view from the 3rd Avenue L. The Guardian newspaper recently published news of plans to build New York City's newest skyscraper. It will be 300 feet tall, dwarfed by the Statue of Liberty by only 5 feet, and will extend 2 to 3 blocks in every direction. It is being constructed atop a former pond and toxic dump site underneath New York's Canal Street that in the 19th century delivered the foul-smelling detritus of the neighborhood named Paradise Square into the Hudson River. It is estimated that the new edifice will cost $2 billion. It will have a recreation center, health clinics, visitation centers, and playrooms for children. It will have 900 beds for clients, New Yorkers, mostly Black, Latino, and immigrant, some of whose ancestors lost 55% of what had been Mexico in the battle that Santa Anna lost to keep African slavery out of this country. You see, the new edifice is a jail. Like 85% of the prisoners at Rikers, they will be in pretrial detention. If they cannot post bail, they stay until they are called to court and advance to prison if found guilty. They will be provided services in jail that the politics of elitism, draconian measures, and fear will not provide outside of prison. Education, employment, decent housing, livable wages, clean streets, health care. Built next to the courthouse, the jail is a symbol of criminal justice reform. Prisoners will be able to get to their court dates on time. The Statue of Liberty and the Empire State Building, iconic edifices symbolizing the largesse and the financial power of America, will live in the shadow of what will be New York's architectural wonder, the tallest jail on planet Earth. 250 years ago, British colonials struck out. Thank you. 250 years ago, British colonials struck out against King George III and claimed their right to trade in enslaved Africans. Charles Stewart purchased Somerset on the docks of Virginia when Somerset was 9 years old. Stewart raised the 9-year-old as his manservant. 20 years later, Stewart took Somerset with him to London. Somerset absconded into the alleys of the British abolition movement. Alas, he was soon captured and put on a ship for Jamaica. The year was 1771. The case was adjudicated in 1772. Granville Sharp, the leading abolitionist lawyer in London, represented Somerset. The judge, Lord Mansfield, declared slavery so odious that there was no place for it, no legal support for it on British soil, and therefore the black should be let free. He warned Stuart that only positive law could legalize and buttress Somerset's enslavement. In 1772, the framers of the Constitution, the Brits who declared a civil war against the overreach of their king, took Lord Mansfield at his word, and in declaring their independence from Britain in 1776, managed to forge a new nation, one that would honor their right to own property in black bodies. They created positive law that stipulated that if a body claimed ownership of itself and escaped to places where property rights in humans were not recognized, the recipient of that body was constitutionally bound to return that black body to its rightful owner. Article 4, Section 2, Paragraph 3 of the United States Constitution. The glue that sweetened the deal for the slaveholding states at the table to say yes, yes, yes to the Union. And why should they have said no? The wealth of the nation was in their coffers in the magnolia estates of an elite that had over the previous 200 years constructed what Foner describes in his second founding as the largest and most powerful slave society in modern history. Foner explains, in slave societies where slavery is central to the economy and slave owners therefore more powerful, the persons who make all the laws are the persons who have slaves themselves. 41 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence owned slaves. Among them, Presidents Washington, Jefferson, and Madison. Jefferson, however, was prescient in that he defined the conundrum that inserts itself even today as the hook in America's song, the riff that structures the song and swings the beat. Jefferson said, "We have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is on one scale and self-preservation on the other." Jefferson's balanced scale frames and elucidates the push-pull, the lurching, as my husband would say, of our history. The pull of maintaining the structure that the founding fathers built, or the push to reimagine and therefore reconstruct an edifice not built on the exploitation and brutalization of labor, but on the principles of a shared humanity in which the perks and privileges and protections and risks are shared across the board, regardless of the color of one's skin. It is the conundrum that haunts us today, and it is symbolized in New York City's newest skyscraper. September 1862, Abraham Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation to signal to the Confederacy that unless they desisted with their plans to separate from the Union, he would apply what we now think of as the nuclear option: manumission of enslaved Africans, the repository of the great wealth of the South's feudal plantation economy. Lincoln was ignored. So, on January 1st, 1863, to follow through on his threat, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation, which by the stroke of a pen was the greatest manumission in history. It unlocked the gates, however, only of the plantations located in the states which were in rebellion, leaving behind 800,000 Africans in bondage in Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, and Delaware states, which remained loyal to the Union. It was a military manumission that did not abolish slavery. Abolition would have to wait for the 13th Amendment in 1865. African men, women, and children, stateless insurgents in the thousands no longer property, owned themselves and bolted for freedom behind Union lines. They had not read, nor did they believe Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy's great truth, that the Negro is not equal to the white man, and that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. Frederick Douglass, exhorting the free and unfreed, gnawed in Lincoln's ear, "Let black men fight, fight black men, fight." And fight they did. 200,000 black soldiers and the black women who worked as spies, cooks, and nurses were necessary ingredients in the Union victory, without which there would not exist a United States of America as we know it. Black leaders encouraged black men to join the Union as a pathway to full citizenship. 40,000 died. Within 1 year of General Lee's surrender, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was passed. All citizens must henceforth enjoy the delineated rights in the same way enjoyed as white citizens. The Enforcement Act of 1871 and 1872, commonly known as the Ku Klux Klan Act, raised the question of the reach of the federal government to protect its citizens. Between 1871 and 1873, federal prosecutors brought nearly 2,500 criminal cases under the Enforcement Act, mostly for conspiracy to hinder voting or to deprive a person of equal protection of the laws because of his race. The reconstructed nation, crafted on the principles that granted citizenship to all born in the United States, deemed slavery unconstitutional, except as a punishment for a duly convicted crime. Black women no longer gave birth to property. 800,000 black men registered to vote. Economic independence for the newly freed was recognized. General Sherman issued Field Order 15 to reserve 400,000 acres of a coastal strip from Charleston, South Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida, for those previously enslaved. Confident in their intelligence and diligence to raise and feed and protect family, to organize community and educate their children, they asked not for revenge, not for money, only for opportunity. Reverend Frazier, spokesperson of the group that met with Edwin Stanton, Lincoln's Secretary of War in 1865, he says, "The way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land and turn it and till it by our own labor. We want to be placed on land until we are able to buy it and make it our own. And I would prefer to live by ourselves, for there is prejudice against us in the South that will take years to overcome." The nation responded, "No," in an echo chamber that reverberated against the mountains and swirled in the valleys of the country's heartland, and in the cacophony that catapulted Confederate flags up the stairs of the nation's Capitol on January 6, 2022. The Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1865 on the heels of the rebel defeat, political and legal chicanery pervasive at the highest levels of state and federal power guaranteed that status of African Americans be frozen within the lowest level of America's social order, American apartheid. Alexander Stephens' notion of the biblical natural order of things, and Jefferson's assessment of safety. On March 30th, 1908, Green Cottonham was arrested in Shelby County, Alabama. Green was born 9 years after murder and mayhem had sealed the coffin of Reconstruction. At 22 years old, he was among the legions of black men and boys being forced into a system that drowned black folk in a sea of perpetual debt, criminalized their poverty, and sentenced them to arbitrary lengths of involuntary servitude. Green committed no crime except having been born Black. According to Doug Blackman, author of Slavery by Another Name, under a standing arraignment between the county and the subsidiary of U.S. Steel Corporation, the sheriff turned the young man over to the company. In return, the subsidiary, Tennessee Coal and Iron and Railroad Company, gave the county $12 a month to pay off Cottenham's fines and fees. In Alabama alone, Blackman continues, hundreds of thousands of pages of public documents attest to the arrests, subsequent sale, and delivery of thousands of African Americans into mines, lumber camps, quarries, farms, and factories. More than 30,000 pages related to debt slavery cases sit in the files of the Department of Justice at the National Archives. Instead of evidence showing Black crime waves, the original records of county jails indicated thousands of arrests for inconsequential charges or for violation of laws specifically written to intimidate Blacks, changing employers without permission, vagrancy, riding freight cars without a ticket, engaging in sexual activity. The term convict leasing is an egregious misnomer. The term shields us from contemplating the depravity of the system and our complicity in allowing it. Convicts were boogeymen created in the imagination of fear and disdain, innocent Black men criminalized, kidnapped, and catapulted into the caverns of the country's criminal justice system. In the 4th year in which Alabama leased its prisoners, 45% of them died. And Jim Crow, a white comedic minstrel in blackface, brands the lie that erases the brutalization, exploitation, and unspeakable horror of 100 years of life in America for too many Black folks after Reconstruction. From across the Atlantic, Hitler was watching. In 1935, 8 days after Germany passed the Reich citizenship law, which disqualified Jews as citizens, Hitler sent 45 leading Nazi legal philosophers and jurists to the American South. These learned lawyers were looking for doctrinal insight in the crafting of positive law to legalize the warehousing of Jews in anticipation of the final solution. What better prototypes for the creation of laws governing apartheid than those crafted by the Americans? And as one author notes, not even South Africa had a set of race laws as developed as those in the United States. However, on December 12, 1942, the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was jolted into action by the bombing of Pearl Harbor only 5 days before. Caught unawares, the United States needed to increase manpower to wage war against Japan. Convict leasing, slavery by another name, had to go. Roosevelt instructed Attorney General Bidle to issue Circular 3591, informing all attorneys general that henceforth peonage and involuntary servitude would be considered slavery and punished as such. December 12, 1941, 6 weeks before my birth, was a coda in the country's 185-year saga to address the legacy of slavery by dismantling one of its pillars. Resistance was percolating. Returning veterans were trees that gave structure and protection to the student movement that hung on the canopy which their resistance had provided during the 1950s. Rosa was not Rosa Parks, was not the little lady, school marmish, in glasses, seated transfixed, alone, and abandoned on a Montgomery bus, as captured in the iconic Life magazine photo of her. At 31 years old, she was an activist, and she had cut her teeth investigating the rape of Black women by white men. The NAACP sent Rosa, described in the Chicago Defender, as the organization's best investigator to Abbeville, Alabama, to investigate the rape of 24-year-old Reese Taylor. It was 1944. No white man had ever been found guilty of raping a Black woman. Rosa operated within an underground fabric of resistance to dismantle the legal pillars of Jim Crow. E.D. Nixon, Pullman car porter and leader of the Montgomery movement, assigned the young Martin Luther King Jr. the task of hosting the mass meeting, catapulting Martin, Rosa, and the boycott into the limelight of the Black freedom struggle. Joanne Robinson, president of the Montgomery Women's Political Council, and John Cannon, head of the business department at Alabama State, overnight mimeographed and distributed 52,500 leaflets calling for a boycott of Montgomery's buses after Rosa Parks was arrested. Amzie Moore, Burma Road veteran, shared his plan to wrest political power through the Black vote with Bob Moses, who with a small band of Mississippi teenagers joined local members of the NAACP with college students from Howard University and took on the most powerful feudal lords in Congress, Senator James O. Eastland, head of the Judiciary Committee, and John Stennis, who was head of the Armed Services Committee. Martin and Reverend Shuttlesworth shook the status quo of what had been the Birmingham of Green Cottonham. The murder of the 4 little girls in the 16th Avenue Baptist Church bombing, the little-known shooting of 2 Black boys that same evening, and the unleashing of dogs and fire hoses on the children of the city galvanized the nation. Resistance was boiling. The young freedom fighters who had risked their lives to ride the buses did not think of themselves as citizens of Mississippi and Alabama. No, they assumed that they were citizens of the nation, and as such, they were entitled to federal protection against abuses of the southern states. Legal pragmatists at the helm, steering the Civil Rights Act through Congress, believed that to argue the Civil Rights Act on the basis of the 14th Amendment on the citizenship of African Americans was to risk defeat. The Commerce Clause of the Constitution prohibits the taxing of packages being sent between states. It was only logical that if packages could not be blocked in their transport between the states, why should Negroes? The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed unanimously on the basis of the Commerce Clause. We were no longer constitutional property, but in a Sisyphean pas de deux, we were not quite constitutional people either. Bayard Rustin, the brilliant general in Martin Luther King's cabinet, tallied the accomplishments of the movement. He says, "We affected institutions that were relatively peripheral, both to the American socioeconomic order and to the fundamental conditions of life for the Negro." Bob Moses broke it down. We got Jim Crow out of public accommodations, but we did not get Jim Crow out of education, housing, employment, or policing. Watts erupted in 1965, a few weeks after the Voting Rights Act was passed. The Wall Street Journal warned, and I quote, "A growing army of such youth is being bred in the Negro sections of cities." Johnson declared crime control a major initiative, signed the Law Enforcement Assistance Act in September 1965, tucking the foundation for mass incarceration neatly into the pocket of his war on poverty. Justice is on one scale, safety on the other. The men, boys, fathers, and sons, and increasingly women snared in the web of social control measures are the green cotton hams of the 21st century, different only in that their labor is no longer needed in our highly technological society, which runs on the products of our mind, not on the brawn of our backs. Denied a 21st century education, surveilled, stopped, and frisked, and warehoused in jails and prisons, they are deportees forced to live outside the guardrails of citizenship. The response of the federal government to the demands of the civil rights wave of the 1960s was consistent with the country's response to the Civil War and to Reconstruction: lock them up in ghettos, in prisons, lock them up. Just as Jefferson advised, justice is on one scale and safety on the other. And lock us up they did. President Nixon told his domestic policy advisor, John Ehrlichman, that he, Nixon, had two enemies: Black folks and anti-war hippies. He had a plan to deal with both groups. If he could associate marijuana with hippies and heroin with blacks, and criminalize heroin and marijuana heavily, he could disrupt those communities, arrest their leaders, and vilify them night after night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? John Ehrlichman answered his rhetorical question. Of course we did. Nixon's manufactured war was on and placed on steroids under the Clinton administration. Huge swaths of Black and Latino communities have been devastated. One out of 81 Black adults is in jail, according to the Sentencing Project. 1 out of 19 Black men has lost the right to vote, and the greatest dilution of the Black vote is felon disenfranchisement, not voter ID. Sentencing in some states, the ratio is 1 in 10. Black men comprise 7% of the nation's population and almost 40% of the incarcerated population. Together with their Latino brothers, they comprise over 60% of the incarcerated. Martin asked a question in 1968, "How long, Lord, how long?" McKinsey's data scientists took a stab at answering Martin's question, and this was a couple of weeks ago, and they said, they're data scientists, they said, if you live in a rural county, 320 years for Black residents, and in places like New York and San Francisco, parity may take 160 years. It is not inconsequential that Martin Luther King Jr.'s last act of resistance was in support of the sanitation workers of Memphis, our green cotton hams. Change requires that we rock the boat and churn the waters of the status quo. We rocked it in the Civil War, we rocked it during Reconstruction, we rocked it during the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. We are living in the age of mass incarceration, metaphorically in the shadow of what will be the planet's tallest jail. See, Jefferson got it wrong. His was a false equivalence between justice and safety. There is no safety in the absence of justice. We are shredding sacred constitutional protections to shore up our carceral state. Search and seizure, due process, the right to a public trial, and effective legal representation, freedom from excessive bail, and cruel and unusual punishments, the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments. Martin carried our 250-year-old nation on his 39-years-old back. He is our cheerleader, cheering us on as we traverse the country's Jericho Road. Come on, children, don't you get weary. Martin understood that freedom is a constant, never-ending struggle, but there is joy and salvation in the fight. It's one of my favorite pictures. I wish for us all joy in the struggle, and thank you. I want to give thanks also to a very special person, Chad Milner, who put together all the slides that you've seen. So, and thank you all.